Hello, my name is Michael Kendrick, and I'm the Director of Supported Decision-Making Initiatives with the Center for Public Representation in Massachusetts. And I'd like to introduce you to supported decision-making. And that's a term that is increasingly being used to describe alternatives to guardianship, where people with disabilities have the opportunity to keep their rights and to make their own decisions, but with support in any way that they may need it. And typically the supporters are people that they have asked to support them. And this could be anywhere from a friend to a family member to someone that is a person that they've met through a service and so on. So the supported decision-making is controlled entirely by the person with the disability. And they pick their supporters. So for instance, if the person needed, in their own mind, needed some help thinking about money issues, they may go to a very different person than if they were thinking through some issues around relationships or jobs or something of a different sort. So supported decision-making is highly individualized, a way for a person to get help with their decision-making at no cost to them. This is entirely a voluntary thing, it's not a service. And in fact, it mimics what people have been doing for centuries, which is that when they have a tough decision on something, they typically like to go to someone who they trust on that particular subject. Now, it isn't always the case that there are people that they can turn to, and so the existing supporters may actually have to assist by identifying new supporters if that is required. Also, though, supported decision-making isn't just about decision-making. It's really more about decision-making about a person's life. So the person's life and life circumstances often dictate the kinds of questions or dilemmas or challenges they would like support with. And so in that way, the pattern of decision-making that the person seeks support on may change with their life circumstances over the years. It's also true that, like any other skill set or competency, that people can become more competent over time and grow and develop in new ways, such that they don't need as much support with something that they used to seek a lot of support on. Now, similarly, the nature of the supporters may change over time because the life circumstances also require issues to be addressed that the previous supporters may not have been able to support the person with their decision-making on. So in this way, if one thinks of it as a very person-centered process, then there really isn't necessarily going to be the same pattern 2 years from now or 5 years from now if a person is still seeking support with their decision-making, because things will have moved on, they will have grown and developed, they will have learned from poor decisions as well as good decisions. And so in this sense, their starting point is quite different, having practiced decision-making for a time. Now, I said at the outset that the supported decision-making has become more well known because of its role as an alternative to guardianship. And I'd like to say a bit more about that, because guardianship has been around since the Roman era as a well-intentioned support for people to protect them and to get assistance and authority around decision-making, but it uses the mechanism of a substituted decision-maker. In other words, the person loses their rights to be a decision-maker when they come under guardianship, at least in a legal sense, and the substituted decision-maker takes their place. And in some cases, this may not be a person that the person themselves would have sought as a supporter. And so in many cases, it can be an imposed guardianship on people or an imposed loss of rights. And so increasingly, in the United States and many other countries, there's a concern that this is much too invasive, much too great taking away of people's rights, And so there's been a search really for what would be the least restrictive alternative. And this is where supported decision-making comes in, because it doesn't restrict the person particularly. In fact, it strengthens their ability to make decisions and to be in charge of their own life. And it reduces the likelihood of the person getting into difficulties, which is, of course, what people think that guardianship will do. But of course, guardianship alone actually doesn't keep people out of difficulties. It may, in some instances, give other people a way to deal with an issue or a problem that may arise, but it doesn't insulate people from the difficulties of life in any way. And in fact, it is when you use guardianship, you're over relying on a single way to safeguard people, when really the better way to think about it is have multiple safeguards, not just simply around decision making, but other supports that people may need in their life. So supported decision making fits very well with that, because with supported decision making, you can blend it with other person-centered supports that the person may require, such as formal supports of one kind or another in the person's life. So you can see then that the formal supports may be present, supported decision-making may be present, and the two together mean that a lot of the difficulties of life will be met on the ground by those kinds of supports. But it goes beyond that, because you can also combine supported decision-making with other things. One of the other things that you can combine it with is essentially a healthcare proxy. So that, in fact, there can be a person that is nominated to speak on behalf of the person on their health care issues. And this is also a very protective safeguard in the instance that the person might not be well enough or in good enough shape to engage on some of those issues. And so it takes care of that in advance with this healthcare proxy. It can also be combined with things like durable power of attorney, which is another way in which, particularly if there are financial and property and asset issues, this is durable power of attorney, means that the provisions are in place if the person can't manage those things at a particular point. And also, it can be combined with other kinds of trusts that can be set up in advance around other kinds of health or financial matters. So in that sense, that's quite a complex array of supports for a person, and it makes the need for guardianship quite unnecessary, even though, in fact, the possibility of still applying for guardianship never is taken away, that people can still apply for guardianship at any point, or others can do it on their behalf. So it's not that one eliminates guardianship as an option. It's really a way to make sure you don't use it as an option, because you have all these other options to work with. Now, at the same time, supported decision-making isn't the panacea, because it doesn't mean that because you have supported decision-making that you'll never make another poor decision in your life. A lot of us have had support throughout our life, and we still make poor decisions on occasion. But what it does is it means that the person is likely to be strengthened in their ability to make good decisions, and also, of course, to learn from the decisions that didn't go so well. So in this sense, thinking again developmentally of supported decision-making, it is, by way of law of averages, a kind of safeguard that over time means that people will be in a better position because of just all of that support being around them. Now, again, the supported decision-making may be in place, but it doesn't mean that people will be respected as being their own decision maker, because there is a presumption often that people make about people with disabilities that they aren't competent to make their own decisions. And so, in fact, the views, opinions, wishes, priorities of the person with a disability are often routinely ignored or overlooked or misinterpreted by any member of the public. So in this sense, supported decision-making can't change all those attitudes, but its advantage really is that it gives the person with a disability quite an array of things by way of having to contend then with those kinds of attitudes that give them a better chance of succeeding against those kind of negative experiences that so many people have had and continue to have. The last thing I'd want to say about supported decision-making is that it is familiar to all of us because we've all been part of either giving support or asking for support on tough decisions that we face. So we're really not inventing anything new. People have been doing this for centuries. But what we are doing is being much more explicit about it so that the full advantage of supported decision-making can be available to larger numbers of people with disabilities than is the case today. And by the way, it wouldn't simply be people with disabilities. It's also being used in, for instance, in aging and in other areas where people may need some support with decision-making. So it won't operate in the same way necessarily because people are all different, but their needs are going to be all different in that sense, but the fundamentals will be the same. So thank you.